Alright. Again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 318, I believe. And today, I want to talk about time. While ago, I needed a drink. While ago, I'm thinking like years at this point. I made a video, I think it was during Daily December a few years ago, where I talked about the fact that each edition of Dungeons and Dragons has its own unique logo. And so because of that, if you are looking at adventures or video games or anything like that, you can actually tell which edition of D&D they're using by just looking at the logo itself. The first two versions of it, like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition, actually have, like, AD&D 2nd Edition actually has 2nd Edition in the name. From that point on, it just says Dungeons and Dragons. But 3rd Edition has a specific, unique logo. 4th Edition has its own unique logo. 5th Edition has its own unique logo. So if you're ever wondering if you're looking at books or anything like that, you can just look at the logo and instantly know which edition of D&D they were written for. And I always really liked that. And so in the video that I made years ago, not only did I show each one of the different logos, I also talked about the unique aspects of that particular system. Things like the original, like basic set and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is all about tables. Everything has a table. Table. You rolled a hit on a table. Your everything is a table. It was really annoying. 2nd edition had THACO and character kits. 3rd edition was massively complicated and multi-classing was required. 4th edition was 4th edition, and 5th edition we all know. But it got me to thinking recently, just like any version of entertainment, the time period that it was written in can actually help kind of define what to expect. A really good example of this, and this just comes from my background as a classically trained musician. Music, in and of itself, we actually classify periods of music not because of, like, arbitrary dates where, like, the Romantics overthrew the classical composers and imprisoned them in dungeon. No, it's just based on the idea that in certain time periods, most of the successful composers all tended to think in a very similar mindset. So if you look at something like the Baroque period of music, which was the first really defined period of music after the medieval period, which in and of itself is not really well defined. It was just everything before Baroque. So the Baroque period of music is defined a lot by having kind of a driving bass line. Like if you listen to anything by Bach, you will always hear this boom 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 boom, and you always have this kind of driving little line. It's very structured and things like that. And so the Baroque period was really defined by the idea of they were creating the rules that would kind of explain music for the next 300 years. Or actually closer to 500 or 600 years. So that's your Baroque period. Then we get into the classical period, which a lot of people just call classical music, and that actually can cover everything all the way from the medieval period all the way through the Romantic and a little bit of early 20th century music. But the actual classical period of music is, if I remember correctly, I think it started in either 16 or 1700 and goes to just before 1800, somewhere in that period. Mozart, really good example of a classical composer. And the classical period of music was all about sticking to a very rigid system. There were very specific rules that you had to follow. And finding ways to kind of work within that system to create really creative things. And then after that, you get to the Romantic period. And the Romantic period was all about, fuck your rules, I will do whatever in the hell I want. And that's where you start getting people like Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky and stuff like that. Like, that's all Romantic. And then we start getting to the early 20th century stuff and things like atonal music and just really, it wasn't even just the Romantic period where it's like, I will make my own rules. You get to atonal music and you just have this thing of, I don't care what rules are. So, bringing that back to tabletop RPGs. Tabletop RPGs that were developed during certain periods of time are going to have things that they focus on. And I thought it would be fun to try and kind of define what each kind of decade of tabletop RPGs, like if you go out and you purchase, because this happens a lot, like they just released a bundle on Bundle of Holding where you can get Palladium 2nd Edition, which is written in the 90s. And so the game itself is going to feel quote-unquote a little bit dated because a lot of the stuff that we kind of take for granted in 2024 as far as what we expect from a tabletop RPG had not become commonplace as of that point. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, is basically kind of the things that you can expect if you get an RPG from the 80s versus an RPG from the 90s versus an RPG from the early 2000s. So yeah, start off with tabletop RPGs in and of themselves started in the 70s. The very first tabletop RPG was 1974. It was Dungeons & Dragons, created by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. It created an entire genre of games, and a lot of the stuff that started with D&D has translated to literally everywhere else. Anything with experience points and level up mechanics, whether we're talking about tabletop RPGs, apps for tracking your workout, whatever, we can all trace that back directly to Dungeons & Dragons. However, D&D was not the only thing that was created, the only tabletop RPG that was created in the 70s. In 7, there was an RPG created called Traveler, which I think still has a where are we? Still has a version that's being updated today. Let me look here real quick before I say the wrong thing. It came out in 77. So yeah, 2016, the most recent version of Traveler, also known as Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition, was released. So Traveler started in 77, still going to today, but it was the first. It was the first step in something that was very different from what D&D was. D&D was a class-based RPG, is still a class-based RPG. Traveler was, I think, the first, it was either one of the first or the first skill-based RPGs. When I say that, what I mean is instead of picking a character class, you pick a collection of skills. In general, that means it's not so much that, oh, well, a warrior has these particular skills. No, you will have a list of skills and you get to kind of pick and choose them to create your own kind of kick a character. That started with Traveler. And when we get to the 80s, games in the 80s in general were, because of the fact that Traveler wasn't D&D, but it was still very popular, the 80s in general, you basically had two kinds of games that would come out. You would have basically kind of D&D clone style games where they were trying to imitate D&D, and then you had skill-based RPGs. And the 80s saw a lot of skill-based RPGs that still exist today. GURPS came out in the 80s, and GURPS is the skilliest of skill-based RPGs. Call of Cthulhu's skill-based RPG, Paranoia, skill-based RPG, things like that. So you had all of these skill-based systems coming up. And then you had other things like the Palladium system, which I mentioned before. You can get second edition on Humble Bundle right now, which was much closer to D&D. But you really didn't have... Like, the big change between RPGs in the 80s was not so much that they played differently, but it was all about the setting. You know, Call of Cthulhu's very, very different than Paranoia, which is very, very different from Traveler. However, mechanically, they used a very similar, not identical. You still couldn't use, you know, stuff from Call of Cthulhu and Traveler or anything, but skill-based is skill-based is skill-based is skill-based is skill-based. There wasn't that much differentiation between the various skill-based systems from a pure mechanical standpoint. And the same was true about most of the class-based systems. Again, they weren't all D&D. They weren't just reflavored D&D or anything like that. But if you had played D&D, you could pick up another class-based system and it would feel very familiar to you. It would not be identical, but compared to the various class-based systems that we have in 2024, there is a massive, massive difference between something like the Cypher system and then something like Pathfinder. Despite the fact that both of those are class-based systems, they're very, very different. Or another good example, the Essence 20 system, which people love on this channel, very, very different from Pathfinder, very, very different from Cypher, very, very different from D&D, and they're all class-based systems. In the 80s, it wasn't that big of a difference. Again, I'm not saying that they were all D&D clones or that all these skill-based systems were just Traveler with a different name, but because the market was still very, very new, playing one skill-based system would give you a leg up on playing literally any other skill-based system, and playing one class-based system would give you a leg up on literally any other class-based system. And that worked pretty well. Again, the market was still very, very small at this point. And so if you do pick up a game from the 80s, you basically are going to have two different flavors with a bunch of little variations. You know, you have red and you have blue. So, yeah. Moving on. When we get to the 90s, starting in, I think it was 91, yeah. Starting in 91, this unknown company called White Wolf introduced an RPG called Vampire the Masquerade that literally changed the world. And what I mean by that specifically is it changed what... it changed how people were making tabletop RPGs. And it was the #2 RPG under D&D, to the point where in the late 90s, D&D was worried that Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness games in general were going to dethrone them as the most popular tabletop RPG in the world. And so, games in the 90s, a lot of them liked to mimic Vampire the Masquerade, but not the way that, like, skill-based RPGs kind of mimicked Traveler or class-based RPGs kind of mimicked D&D. The thing that a lot of 90s-based RPGs were mimicking was the kind of internal conflict that Vampire the Masquerade massively encouraged. Vampire the Masquerade, you could have a team that had different motivations, sometimes conflicting motivations, depending on what clan each one of the vampires was from, whether they supported the masquerade or not. Like, there was a lot of different things. And so factions started to become a really, really big deal in the 90s in general, where a lot of even established tabletop RPGs started adding factions that your player could belong to or could have similar ideals to, that would create inter-party conflict. And so if you're picking up like a random RPG that was published in the 90s, that wasn't just an update of an 80s RPG. Like I said, Palladium second edition came out in 96, but it was still Palladium. But if you pick up an RPG in the 90s, one of the things you're probably going to run into is there's going to be some sort of faction system or something that encourages inter-party conflict. Because again, Vampire the Masquerade and the rest of the World of Darkness games were so incredibly popular because it just wasn't a thing before. Another thing that, again, Vampire the Masquerade did, but I didn't really see it start getting really popular until later on in like the 2000s and definitely in the 2010s, was, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, because I was not playing RPGs in the 90s. In the 90s, first of all, I was very, very young. But second of all, I grew up in a very conservative Christian household, which believed that tabletop RPGs were of the devil. And a game about vampires and magic? No fucking way. So I was not playing any of these games. I just, having researched it later in my life to understand where games have come from, this is my understanding. So if either you were playing at that point or you do still play like the original 90s version and I'm getting something wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments down below. So anyway, Vampire the Masquerade started the dice pool style system, which was a very different way to play games. Instead of everything being reliant on either a D20 roll, for most class-based RPGs, they were all D20s. And then a lot of the skill-based ones, they would use D100 rolls, which is basically 2D10s. And they were also called percentile rolls. So, like Call of Cthulhu's percentile-based game. Now you have this thing where instead of trying to get a single total above a certain number, you would have a pool of dice that each one rolled individually. You wouldn't add them together, and you would just see how many successes you got, and that would decide if you were to succeed or fail. Like I said, Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness games use that for a decent amount of the time. I know they use it now. I believe they pioneered the system, but I might be wrong about that. But that aspect of the World of Darkness games just didn't really catch on in the 90s. The thing that really did get a catch on was, again, the inter-party conflict faction type system, and kind of an emphasis on storytelling versus just dungeon delving. Early tabletop RPGs were very much focused on go into the dungeon, get loot, come out alive. When you look at something like Call of Cthulhu, which again started in the 80s, that started the kind of emphasis on storytelling over like looting and stuff like that, because Call of Cthulhu, you're not looting much, you're just trying to survive. But in the 90s, especially again with Vampire the Masquerade and other things that were coming out around that time, you started getting a really strong emphasis on the idea of the story and the setting was most interesting, and you wanted to tell interesting stories while also still doing dungeon crawling and stuff like that. So yeah, if you're getting a 90s based RPG, Look, it may be hidden somewhere in it pretty far, but look for some sort of faction-based system or something that can introduce inter-party conflict. And look for more rules focusing on kind of role-playing, storytelling type stuff. So, moving on. When we get to the 2000s, something massive happens. Year 2000, D&D 3rd edition comes out. In the same year, I believe, they released the open game license. And that was massive. Because it meant that people could use the rules that were designed for the most popular tabletop RPG of all time, and they could create their own games on top of it. And you saw this massive increase in games that were basically D&D but not. Like, there was a Star Wars RPG that they used for Star Wars The Old Republic. Or, sorry, Knights of the Old Republic? Not The Old Republic, that's the new one. That's the MMO. But Knights of the Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic 2 actually used the Star Wars TTRPG that Wizards of the Coast designed, and it was D&D in space. Like, if you actually play Knights of the Old Republic, when you're building your character, look at the feats that you can choose. They are identical to the feats that you use in D&D 3rd edition, because it was a 3rd edition game. And so the 2000s, almost the entire decade, the 2000s was just everybody make a D&D like. They eventually started calling them, I think they called them the D20 system for a little while, but the D20 system was everywhere. There was tons of class-based RPGs that had feats, and you used a D20, so it was all based on the open game license. So if you're picking a random RPG from the 2000s, there's a better than average chance you're going to be picking up a D20 based system. Does that mean that was all that was there? No. If I remember correctly, I believe Shadowrun. Let us look. Shadowrun. When did it come? So yeah, the first version of Shadowrun came out in the late 90s, but 2nd and 3rd edition came out in 92 and 98. So Shadowrun had started technically in the late 80s, but it really got its things going in the 90s. And then the 4th edition of Shadowrun came out in 2005. Now, Shadowrun in and of itself, not D&D. It's a skill-based system that I don't believe uses percentile dice. But it was still going pretty strong. So it's not that I'm saying that all games in 2000 to 2010 are D20 based, but a large part of the market used in some way the open game license. Because again, it was the most popular tabletop RPG in the world. The 3rd edition rules in and of themselves were very, very robust. If you wanted to create your own version of the rules, you didn't have to design much yourself. The bones were there. You just had to add on to it. And there was just so much that you could take from it that developing tabletop RPGs using the open game license was significantly easier. Yeah, that was the big defining thing of 2000 to 2010. So yeah, moving on. Now, the 2010s are kind of interesting because we actually have kind of a fragmenting here. Because the previous decade we talked about really only covers from about 2000 to about 2008. And the reason why was in 2008, D&D 4th edition was launched. And that massively changed things. You had the introduction of Pathfinder. There we go. I have to look up exactly when it launched. Yeah. So, 2009, first edition of Pathfinder comes out. Which, again, Pathfinder is a D&D clone. Pathfinder is D&D, like, even compared to something like the Star Wars tabletop RPG, which is basically D&D in space. Pathfinder is just D&D. So you had Pathfinder that started becoming very, very popular, but wouldn't really hit its stride for a few more years. And because of the kind of backlash brought on by D&D 4th edition, you started seeing some really interesting things. First of all, you started seeing the OSR movement started technically around 2006, 2007 with a couple things like Osric, Labyrinth Lord, and Sword and Wizardry. But you started seeing these games that were coming out that were meant to emulate the old 80s style of games, and that started becoming pretty popular in the late 2010s and then the early in the late 2000s, early to 2010s. You started seeing the old school renaissance. In addition to that, 2010 introduced Apocalypse World, which, if you're not familiar with that particular title, you might be familiar with the moniker Powered by the Apocalypse. Powered by the Apocalypse games are one of the largest subsections of games that currently exists. I'm relatively certain there are at least as many Powered by the Apocalypse games now as there were D20 powered games in the 2010s, and open game licenses and stuff like that. Powered by the Apocalypse and Apocalypse World in and of itself was this massive change, and it really inspired the market going into the 2010s. Apocalypse World and the Powered by the Apocalypse games are very rules light, and it's not to say that there weren't rules light games before. But trying to see if I can find out when it was first published. Sorry, doing a couple different things right now. Yeah, that's 2013. Okay, cool. So, that's not to say that there weren't rules light RPGs before, but they were very, very rare. And to be perfectly honest, I can't think of a single rules light RPG that came out before the 2000s, 2010s. So if any of you guys can give me a good example of a rules light RPG from like the 80s or 90s, put it in the comments down below. But Powered by the Apocalypse, you had your playbooks instead of classes. Everything was much more simple. It was designed for much shorter campaigns. Like, again, to get from level 1 to level 20 in D&D 2nd edition could take you years, if not the better part of a decade. The same is true about the 3rd edition, playing from 1 to 20, and then eventually, when they started releasing rules for higher level play, it could take, like I said, over a decade. Longer than D&D 3rd edition was supported. You might have been playing a D&D 3rd edition on your first character. And Powered by the Apocalypse simply wasn't designed for decade-long campaigns. It's designed for much shorter stuff. There was significantly a significantly lower amount of levels you could attain. It was much more about storytelling. And it really inspired the indie TTRPG market to explode in the 2010s. Things like Lasers and Feelings came out in 2013. And that is an entire genre of rules like tabletop RPGs. And you started seeing a lot more indie developers coming out everywhere. Things like the Dragon Age RPG came out in 2010, and that used the age system, which again, still class-based, but was very, very different from your D&D, your standard D&D style thing, where there's only 3 classes. Stuff like that. So when you get into the 2010s, which technically started as early as like 2008, you start seeing a lot of indie titles, a lot of rules light titles, and a lot of stuff that the entire reason that they published the game was to create something that was not D&D. So you start seeing more dice pool based things, just anything they can do to make it play nothing like D&D. And then 2014 happens. What in the world happened in 2014? Well, D&D 5th edition launched, and again, it massively changed the world. They updated the OGL so that people could start publishing 5th edition content. And D&D 5th edition, in and of itself, revitalized tabletop RPGs in general. Things like Critical Role, Tabletop, what was it called? Is it Dungeon Dads or something similar to that? There's a bunch of different live play style shows and podcasts and things like that that came out that all were either using D&D 5th edition or were somehow kind of tangentially related to it. And so 5th edition made RPGs cool again. Which I guess they were never quote-unquote cool, but it made them popular. Celebrities started talking about their D&D characters. Celebrities started playing D&D. You know, watching Terry Crews play D&D is definitely fun. Vin Diesel played D&D with Matt Mercer as his dungeon master. That in and of itself was really interesting. So starting into 2014, you had D&D 5th edition, which owned the market. You had all the people that were trying to be D&D 5th edition. You had all the people that were using the OGL to create their own versions of D&D 5th edition. And then you still had other... Really? Stop it. Then you still had other RPGs coming out that were very, very different. Numenera, which was the first game that used the Cypher system RPG, came out in 2013. So right before 5th edition became popular, you had a load of really big indie RPGs that kind of exploded. Green Ronin Publishing made a name for themselves using their age system, which is still used today in things like the Expanse RPG. Monty Cook made a name for themselves with Numenera and the Cypher system. And it just goes on and on and on and on. So when you're looking at the 2010s to the 2020s, you basically have pre and post 5th edition, where pre is like this rise of kind of indie games and rules light games, and then post is 5th edition is everything, but still an emphasis on indie RPGs and stuff like that as well. So if you're trying to come up with like a theme for the 2010s, the theme is really, there isn't one. just about anything you could think of kind of happened in the 2010s, and there's lots of nonsense. When we get to the 2020s, again, it kind of expands upon the idea of you have either D&D and D&D like games, and then things that are doing everything they can to not be D&D. And both markets are really, really cool, really, really interesting. Like I said, like Open Legend was one of my favorite games that came out in... when did Open Legend come out? Let's see if I can find... Trying to see if I can find exactly when Open Legend came out. I believe is around 2017, 2018, somewhere around there. But yeah, still one of my favorite systems ever. Skill-based system, kind of a hybrid dice pool / more traditional D20 based system. But anyway, so yeah, going into the 2020s and 2024 exactly, there's just so many different things. Powered by the Apocalypse is stronger than it's ever been. New systems are coming out every other second. Things like Fabula Ultima has been doing very, very well. Cypher Systems doing amazingly well through Monte Cook Games. The Age system is becoming a lot more focused on licenses, with Green Ronin. Green Ronin focusing a little bit more on... what do we have? The Expanse, and other stuff like that. Yeah, like I've said this. Oh, and then there's tons of lasers and feelings hacks and other stuff like that. Pathfinder is, to be perfectly honest, Pathfinder has been doing very poorly since 5th edition got really popular. Not when it launched, but probably about 4 or 5 years after 5th edition launched, especially right around Pathfinder 2nd edition, which was 2018. Probably about a year or two after Pathfinder 2nd edition came out, people realized that 2nd edition really wasn't all that great. It was overdeveloped. There were too many rules. And because of that, it became very monotonous to play, because depending on the choices you made at character creation, the game basically played itself after character creation, because you had to be so specialized in order to do well that you really, in combat, in social encounters, whatever, you really only had 1 or 2 different choices that you could make at any given time, because your character was built to do a very, very specific thing. So Pathfinder in and of itself has not been doing great, and then all the controversies that came out about them, you know, treating their employees badly, treating their artists really, really badly, stuff like that started coming out. People started realizing it wasn't the company that they thought it was. So yeah, Pathfinder hasn't been doing super well. But basically everything else, I mean, D&D is still D&D. It is still absolutely at the top of the market. But there's so many other systems that exist out there right now that are just amazing and wonderful that you really can't have an overarching theme to the 2020s decade of RPGs. There's just so much variety and so many different things. And because of a combination of things like the old school Revolution, where game mechanics from like the 90s and 80s are coming back and becoming very popular, while at the same time you have games like Fabula Ultima that are introducing brand new ways to play that are specifically designed to not work like traditional tabletop RPGs. It's such a crazy time to be a TTRPG fan. Interested to hear what you guys think. For anyone that was actually playing during any of these decades, am I missing out on something that was really big during any of those decades? Have I misclassified a decade going, well, no, the 90s wasn't about World of Darkness. It was actually about paranoia. Which came out in the 80s, by the way. Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, it's all for me today. I will see you guys next time, all right? Bye-bye.